In the summer of 1687, Virginia's Tidewater region looked calm on the surface, tobacco fields waving in the heat, riverboats drifting along the James, planters counting profits. But beneath that calm, fear spread like rot through the ruling class. Rumors crept through taverns and plantations. The servants are meeting. The slaves are talking to the poor whites. Something is coming. What frightened Virginia's elites most was not rebellion by slaves alone. It was the possibility of unity. Because for the first time in the colony's history, enslaved Africans, indentured servants, and poor free whites were rumored to be planning a joint uprising. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past, which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The Virginia Tidewater region sprawled along the rivers like grasping fingers, the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac. These waterways weren't just geographic features. They were the arteries of a brutal economy built on human bondage. The air itself seemed thick with contradictions. The sweet, cloying smell of tobacco leaves drying in the sun mixed with the acrid stench of sweat, blood, and despair. By this time, Virginia had been transformed. The colony that had struggled for survival just decades earlier now thrived on a singular crop, tobacco. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost. The system of indentured servitude that had initially provided labor was giving way to something far more sinister and permanent chattel slavery. The plantations stretched across the landscape like small kingdoms, each a world unto itself. The great planters like William Fitzhugh, Ralph Wormley, and others controlled vast estates worked by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved Africans. These weren't the massive operations that would later characterize the Deep South, but they were large enough, isolated enough, and brutal enough to create a powder keg of resentment. The enslaved population of Virginia in 1687 was diverse in ways that history often forgets. Some had been born in Africa from the regions of modern-day Angola, the Kingdom of Congo, the Bight of Biafra, and the Gold Coast. They carried with them languages, religions, military traditions, and social structures that wouldn't be erased by the Middle Passage. Others were country-born, children of enslaved people born in Virginia or the Caribbean. They spoke English, understood the colonial system intimately, and often served as crucial bridges between African-born workers and the world of their enslavers. Among this population were skilled artisans, blacksmiths who could forge tools and weapons, carpenters who built the very structures of the plantation economy, boatmen who navigated the rivers and knew every creek and inlet. There were field workers who understood the rhythm of the seasons and the land better than many of their masters. There were domestic workers who moved through the plantation houses, invisible yet seeing everything. Each carried within them the memory of freedom, or the stories of freedom passed down, and the burning knowledge that what had been done to them was wrong. The 1680s had seen Virginia's colonial government pass increasingly harsh laws designed to codify and harden racial slavery. The casual brutality that had always existed was now being given legal sanction and structure. The Virginia slave codes were transforming human beings into property with a thoroughness that was chilling. Enslaved people could be whipped, branded, or maimed for infractions. Running away could result in death. Teaching an enslaved person to read was forbidden. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal standing. Children followed the condition of their mother, ensuring that slavery would be perpetual and hereditary. But perhaps most dangerous for the colonial authorities was the concentration of enslaved people. On large plantations, dozens worked side by side in the tobacco fields. They shared quarters, ate together, and most importantly, they could talk. Despite laws against assembly, despite the threat of informers, despite the ever-present threat of violence, they could communicate, and in the spring of 1687, they began to do more than talk. They began to plan. Several factors converged to make 1687 a year of particular tension. The tobacco economy, while profitable for planters, was notoriously unstable. prices fluctuated wildly. A bad harvest could mean disaster, and when planters faced economic pressure, they took it out on the enslaved workers, demanding more work, providing less food, selling family members to raise cash. There had also been recent arrivals. A ship from the Caribbean in late 1686, another from West Africa in early 1687. New people meant new stories, new ideas, new knowledge. Enslaved people from Barbados brought tales of the island's brutal conditions but also of resistance. Those from Africa brought military knowledge, memories of how warriors organized and fought in their homelands. One story that circulated spoke of successful maroon communities in Jamaica, where escaped slaves had fought the English to a standstill in the mountains. Another told of a revolt in Barbados years earlier that had nearly succeeded. These weren't just stories. They were proof that resistance was possible, that the system wasn't invincible. The conspiracy that would become known as the Virginia Tidewater Plot didn't spring up overnight. It grew slowly, carefully, through networks that already existed beneath the surface of plantation life. It began with family connections. Enslaved people on neighboring plantations were often related. Brothers and sisters sold to different masters. Husbands and wives separated, but close enough to maintain contact. Parents and children divided, but not defeated. These family ties created natural channels of communication that white authorities rarely understood or acknowledged. Then there were the skilled workers who moved between plantations. Boatmen who transported tobacco to market or ferried goods, and people along the rivers saw multiple plantations and could carry messages. Blacksmiths whose skills were valuable enough that planters would lend them out to neighbors for repairs. Midwives who attended births across the region. Each journey was an opportunity to share information, to gauge support, to build the network. Religious gatherings, though carefully monitored, provided another cover. Christianity was being used to justify slavery, but enslaved people were transforming the religion into something else, a faith that emphasized liberation, that spoke of Moses leading his people out of bondage, that promised justice. When they sang spirituals, they sang in code. When they prayed for deliverance, and not always in the hereafter. The details of the plot, as they would later be revealed, were ambitious and sophisticated. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising born of rage. It was a calculated attempt to overthrow the entire system of slavery in the Tidewater region. The conspirators planned to coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple plantations. They would strike at night, when darkness provided cover and when many planters would be vulnerable in their homes. The goal was to seize weapons, muskets, pistols, swords, and tools that could be turned into weapons. They would kill those masters known for particular cruelty, but they hoped to take others hostage, perhaps as bargaining chips. Once they had secured several plantations, they would move to the rivers. The boatmen among them knew every vessel, every dock, every navigable creek. They could seize ships and boats, cutting off the planters' ability to escape or summon help. The rivers that had brought enslaved Africans to Virginia in chains would become the highways of their liberation. Some wanted to fight their way to the frontier, where they could establish a fortified community beyond colonial reach, like the Maroons of Jamaica. Others spoke of seizing a ship and sailing south to Spanish Florida, where they had heard that escaped slaves could find refuge. A few even dreamed of seizing enough ships to attempt a return to Africa, though most recognized this as fantasy. But all agreed on one thing. They would rather die fighting for freedom than live another day in bondage. What made the conspiracy particularly dangerous, and what captured imaginations when it was later discovered, was the sophisticated system of secret communications the conspirators developed. In the tobacco fields, where dozens worked within sight and earshot of overseers, they developed coded language. A song about crossing the river might actually be about the planned escape route. A discussion of whether might encode the timing of the uprising. They borrowed from African tonal languages, from coded spirituals, from the thieves' cant of London criminals who had been transported to Virginia. They used dead drops messages left in hollowed trees, under certain stones, in the rafters of barns. These weren't written. Most were illiterate by law. but consisted of objects whose meanings had been agreed upon. A certain type of knotted cord might indicate how many days until the uprising. An arrangement of stones might identify which plantations were ready. The blacksmiths played a crucial role. Forging tools gave them access to metal and fire, but it also gave them legitimate reasons to be working late, to have private spaces, and to create weapons disguised as agricultural implements. A hoe could become a blade. A hammer was already a weapon. They began stockpiling carefully, a few pieces at a time. The most ingenious aspect was how they used the plantation system's own structures against it. Sunday was the traditional day off, when enslaved people had time for their own gardens, for family, for church. But it also became the day when the most traveling happened, when messages moved fastest along the network. Planters thought they were being generous. They were actually providing the infrastructure for rebellion. By late spring of 1687, the conspiracy had grown to involve enslaved people across multiple counties in the Tidewater region. Estimates vary, but historians believe anywhere from 50 to several hundred people knew of the plot to varying degrees. This was both the conspiracy's strength and its fatal weakness. The core group consisted of perhaps a dozen men, most of whom had proven themselves leaders in their communities. There was Sam, a blacksmith who had been born in Virginia, but whose father had been a warrior in the Kingdom of Congo. Sam understood both worlds. He could speak English fluently, understood colonial law and customs, but he also carried traditional knowledge from his father. There was Mingo, an African-born man who had arrived just 2 years earlier, but whose bearing and confidence suggested high status in his homeland. He spoke little English, but had earned respect through his dignity and his willingness to stand up to overseers, absorbing brutal beatings without crying out. There was Jack Hawkins, who took his master's surname as was common, but despised the man himself. Jack was a boatman who knew the rivers like his own hands, who could navigate in darkness, who had contacts at every landing between the Rappahannock and the James. And there was Sarah, one of the few women in the core group. Her inclusion was necessary because so much of the plantation communication network ran through women, the domestic workers, the cooks, the midwives. Sarah was a cook in a prominent planter's household, which meant she heard things, saw letters, understood the political currents that her master discussed over dinner. She was also brilliant and brave beyond measure. Each of these leaders was responsible for organizing people on several plantations. They held no formal meetings, which is too dangerous, but communicated through the network they'd built. A song sang in the fields, a message passed during a Sunday visit, a mark left on a tree. As the plot developed, tensions emerged within the conspiracy about how violent the uprising should be. Everyone agreed that armed resistance was necessary. There was no other way to overcome the systematic violence of slavery. But what exactly that meant varied. Some, scarred by years of brutality, wanted revenge. They spoke of killing all the white people on the plantations, men, women, and children. For them, there could be no half measures, no mercy for those who had shown none. Others argued for a more strategic approach. Kill only those who resisted, they said. Take the rest hostage. Use them as bargaining chips. Perhaps even try to convince some of the poorer whites, the indentured servants, the small farmers who themselves suffered under the great planters, to join the cause. Sam, the blacksmith, was particularly eloquent on this point. He argued that indiscriminate killing would unite all whites against them, would make escape impossible, and would eliminate any chance of negotiation. He wanted to win, not just to strike a blow. But Mingo, the African-born warrior, countered that the colonists would never negotiate with slaves in good faith. Any hesitation would be seen as weakness. Only total victory would secure freedom, and total victory required total commitment. These debates happened in whispers, in the dark and stolen moments, and they remained unresolved, which meant that if the uprising came, there would be no unified plan for what came after the initial strike. The practical preparations accelerated. The blacksmiths worked overtime, forging implements that could serve dual purposes. The boatmen began noting which vessels were least guarded, which could be taken quickly. The field workers started stockpiling supplies, dried food, water containers, anything that could be hidden. They made rough maps, scratched in dirt, and committed to memory. They identified who on each plantation could be trusted, who might inform, who could fight. They noted where weapons were kept in the plantation houses, where the powder and shot were stored. Some began to practice. In the woods, far from the quarters, a few men would gather to drill with makeshift weapons, sticks standing in for swords, rocks for musket balls. They taught each other what they knew of combat, of military formations, of tactics. Mingo shared knowledge from African warfare. A former sailor taught others how to handle a ship. They also prepared mentally and spiritually. In secret religious ceremonies that blended African traditions with Christianity, they asked for strength, for courage, for victory. They made talismans, charms, objects that connected them to ancestors and to God. Whether these offered real protection didn't matter. They offered hope, and hope was a weapon too. The religious dimension of the conspiracy cannot be understated. Christianity, as taught by the planters, emphasized obedience. Slaves, obey your masters. But enslaved people weren't passive recipients of this ideology. They transformed it. They focused on Exodus, on Moses confronting Pharaoh, on the liberation of the Hebrew people from bondage. They sang about crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land. They identified with Jesus, the revolutionary, Jesus who suffered but would return in glory, Jesus who promised that the last would be first. But they also maintained African religious practices. They prayed to ancestors, to spirits, to deities whose names they whispered in the dark. They created a syncretic faith that drew strength from multiple sources. If the Christian God wouldn't free them, perhaps the ancestors would. If neither came through, they would free themselves. One man, known only as the preacher, moved between plantations leading these religious gatherings. He was protected by his perceived harmlessness. White authorities allowed enslaved people to worship, thinking it made them more docile. They didn't understand that the same religion they used to justify slavery could be transformed into a revolutionary ideology. The preacher was careful. He never explicitly called for violence in his sermons. But his message was clear. God sided with the oppressed. Pharaoh had seemed all-powerful too. Justice was coming, if not from heaven, then from human hands. Every conspiracy's greatest vulnerability is its people, and the Virginia Tidewater Plot would fall victim to this fundamental truth. In late June 1687, with the uprising planned for early July, one of the conspirators broke under the weight of fear, doubt, or opportunism. His name, according to records, was Billy, a house servant on a plantation in Middlesex County. Billy had been brought into the conspiracy's outer circle, knew enough to be dangerous, but wasn't part of the core leadership. This was the network's error, expanding too rapidly, including people who weren't fully committed. What motivated Billy to betray the conspiracy remains unclear. Some suggest he was caught stealing and offer information in exchange for leniency. Others claim he genuinely believed the uprising would fail and wanted to save lives. Still others suggest he was promised freedom, that ultimate carrot that the planters could dangle before any enslaved person. Whatever his motivation, Billy went to his master, Arthur Spicer, on the evening of June 28, 1687. He told Spicer that enslaved people across the region were planning a coordinated uprising that would happen within days, that masters would be killed in their beds. Spicer initially didn't believe him. Stories of slave conspiracies were common, sometimes real, often imagined or exaggerated. Planters lived in constant fear that their human property would turn on them, and that fear made them see plots everywhere. But Billy was insistent, and he knew details of specific names, specific plantations, specific plans. Spicer made a decision that would change everything. He sent riders to neighboring planters and to the colonial authorities in Jamestown. Within 24 hours, the entire Tidewater region was in uproar. Planters armed themselves, barricaded their homes, and began interrogating their enslaved workers. The colonial militia was mobilized. Magistrates began emergency sessions to question suspects. The investigation was swift and brutal. Enslaved people were rounded up, chained, and subjected to interrogation that was really torture. The legal niceties that applied to white colonists didn't apply to slaves. They could be whipped until they confessed and could be subjected to any technique that might extract information. Sam the blacksmith was among the first arrested. Someone, probably Billy, had identified him as a ringleader. He was taken from his forge in chains, his wife and children watching helplessly. In the jail at Middlesex County Courthouse, he was questioned for hours. Sam held out for 3 days. The details of what was done to him aren't fully recorded, but the outcome was. He eventually gave up names, places, plans. Not everything. Sam was brave, but enough to confirm Billy's story and to implicate others. One by one, the conspirators were rounded up. Jack Hawkins was seized as he worked on a boat. Mingo was taken from the fields, fighting until he was beaten unconscious. Sarah was arrested in her master's kitchen, maintaining her dignity even as she was dragged away in chains. The network that had taken months to build was torn apart in days. As the conspiracy unraveled, a grim calculus played out across the Tidewater. Planters had to balance multiple concerns. They wanted to punish the conspirators severely enough to deter future rebellions, but they also didn't want to destroy their own property. Enslaved people were expensive investments. This created a perverse situation where the most valuable enslaved people, skilled artisans like Sam, field workers in their prime, might receive lighter sentences than less valuable ones. The colonial authorities wanted public executions to send a message, but individual planters sometimes intervened to save their human property. At the same time, some enslaved people saw an opportunity in the chaos. By informing on others, by confirming information the authorities already knew, they might save themselves or even earn rewards. The conspiracy had depended on solidarity, but slavery systematically undermined solidarity, pitting the oppressed against each other in a desperate struggle for survival. This is one of slavery's most insidious aspects. It didn't just exploit people's labor. It corrupted their relationships with each other. Trust became dangerous. The community became risky. Looking out for one's own survival could mean betraying others. Not everyone broke, of course. Many conspirators, when captured, said nothing even under torture. They went to their deaths, protecting their fellows. But enough talk that the authorities were able to piece together most of the plot. The trials of the Tidewater conspirators were less legal proceedings than theatrical performances designed to reassert white supremacy and colonial order. They took place in county courthouses across the Tidewater region throughout July 1687. Enslaved people had no right to trial by jury in Virginia at this time. Instead, their cases were heard by courts of oyer and terminer, panels of justices of the peace who served as both judge and jury. The accused had no right to legal representation, could not testify in their own defense, and faced judges who were themselves slaveholders with every interest in finding them guilty. The proceedings were perfunctory. Witnesses, usually other enslaved people who had been promised leniency for testifying, would describe what they knew of the plot. The accused would sometimes be allowed to speak, though anything they said could be used against their co-conspirators. Then the justices would retire briefly before delivering verdicts. The outcome was never in doubt. Of the dozens brought to trial, nearly all were convicted. The only question was the sentence. Virginia law provided a range of punishments for enslaved people convicted of conspiracy to rebel. At the extreme end was death by hanging, by burning, or by being broken on the wheel. But there were also sentences of physical mutilation, branding, whipping, castration, amputation of ears or limbs. The ringleaders, Sam, Mingo, Jack Hawkins, and others identified as central to the conspiracy were sentenced to death. Their owners were compensated by the colonial government for the loss of their property. This was crucial. If owners weren't compensated, they might be reluctant to turn in conspirators. The colonial government essentially bought the right to execute enslaved people from their masters. Others received brutal physical punishments. They were publicly whipped. 39 lashes were common, delivered with a whip that could flay flesh from bone. Some were branded on the cheek or shoulder with a hot iron, marking them permanently as would-be rebels. A few were castrated, a punishment that spoke to white fears about black masculinity and sexuality. Some were transported, sold to the Caribbean, where conditions were even more brutal than in Virginia. This was seen as a middle ground, severe punishment that removed dangerous individuals from the colony without executing them and thus destroying property. Sarah, the cook, presented a dilemma. Women were rarely executed, and she was valuable property. Skilled cooks were always in demand. She was sentenced to 100 lashes and to be sold out of the colony. She was last recorded being shipped to Barbados, where she disappears from history. Those on the conspiracy's periphery, those who had known of the plot but weren't active participants, often received lighter sentences, public whippings, sometimes just confinement. The authorities wanted to punish, but also to calibrate their response. Too lenient, and they encouraged resistance. Too harsh, and they destroyed valuable property and potentially created martyrs. The executions were public spectacles, designed to terrorize the enslaved population and reassure white colonists. They took place in county seats and at major plantations, places where large numbers of enslaved people could be forced to watch. Sam was the first to die on July 15, 1687. He was hanged at the Middlesex County Courthouse. The authorities recorded that he met his death with dignity, saying little except to ask God for mercy. Enslaved people from across the county were required to witness the execution. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who resist. Mingo's execution was particularly cruel, perhaps because he was African-born, perhaps because he had fought so fiercely when arrested. He was sentenced to be burned alive. This execution took place at a major plantation, and its brutality shocked even some white observers. Mingo sang as he died songs in his native language that none of the white observers understood, but that other African-born people in the crowd recognized as songs of war and defiance. Jack Hawkins was hanged at a public landing on the river he had navigated so often. His body was left hanging for days as a warning to other boatmen. Birds picked at the corpse until it was finally cut down and thrown in an unmarked grave. What often gets forgotten in the historical record is what happened to the families of the conspirators. Sam had a wife and 3 children. When he was executed, his master sold them south, splitting the family up to maximize profit and to remove potential sources of continued resistance. Sam's wife never saw her children again. The same pattern repeated across the region. Children were separated from their parents. Spouses were divided. Entire family networks that had formed the backbone of the resistance were deliberately torn apart. This was punishment beyond the official sentences, collective punishment designed to destroy any remnant of community that might sustain future resistance. Some enslaved people who lost family members to execution or transportation try to maintain contact, sending messages through the informal networks that crisscrossed the colonial South. A few succeeded in learning what happened to loved ones. Most never knew. Their family members simply disappeared into the vast machinery of slavery, leaving behind only grief and uncertainty. In the months and years following the crushing of the conspiracy, an eerie quiet settled over the Tidewater plantations. Enslaved people still worked the tobacco fields, still navigated the rivers, still cooked and built and served. But something had changed. The songs were different now, more careful, more coded. The networks of communication remained, but went deeper underground. Trust became harder to give and harder to earn. The memory of betrayal, of torture, of public executions stayed fresh. But so did the memory of the conspiracy itself, of how close they had come, of what might have been. And in that memory lay the seeds of future resistance, of the long struggle that would continue for nearly 2 centuries more until slavery finally fell. The whispers continued, quieter now, but never silent. The thunder would come again.